I want to begin by stating that there are many kinds of Christians that, good Christians, and we appreciate their friendship. It only took a few thousand years, but we finally got here, and it's a beautiful thing. So the following conversation isn't meant for convincing Christians that they're wrong. Judaism is not a proselytizing religion. We believe heavenly reward is not exclusive to us, and what they believe is their right. The purpose of this conversation is to shed light on the constant aggressive assaults on uneducated secular Jews by missionaries. And when they attack us, we have no choice but to point out how they've strayed from the truth. To the Jew who's listening, I hope this conversation provides you with enough support so you can stand your ground and continue to educate yourself about your own Judaism and be aware of the deceptive tactics these missionaries use. And now for my first question. So Jesus is an elusive figure in history. Some even debate if he even existed and if he was an observant Jew. And of course, there are various references to Yeshu HaNotzri in the Talmud. So who was the historical Jesus? And I ask this because 2,000 or so years ago, this Middle Eastern Jew who is now worshipped by billions of people, granted it mostly the result of the sword, but regardless of who he was, why don't people focus on the fact that not one contemporary historian wrote about him during his lifetime? Philo of Alexandria, zilch. The Jews and Romans, nada. Who is Jesus?
Well, you're begging the question. That is precisely the problem. The problem is that we have no contemporaneous historian that was not a Christian that wrote a single word about him. Our only first century sources are Christian sources. The oldest surviving Christian sources are Paul, who wrote during the 50s. What makes Paul so problematic, actually there are many things that make Paul problematic, historically, theologically, but what is germane to your question is that Paul never met Jesus. Paul claims that he was an enemy of the Christian faith during the time that Jesus was alive. So we have no other sources. There are methods that are used to determine who was anyone of antiquity. Who could they possibly be? Now, you raise the point about, what would a person who's living in the first century be running around and screaming around about that might get him in trouble with the empire, that might get someone crucified? Well, if you walked around saying that the end of the world was coming and the Roman Empire was going to collapse, the Roman Empire would consider that treasonous, and you would then be worthy of crucifixion. Of course, you're presuming that Jesus was actually crucified. That's very, very likely. Is he a mythical figure? It depends. It depends on Nazareth. Let me sort of break this down for you. What points people in the direction that there was somebody who lived in the empire during the first third of the first century, is that Matthew and Luke, the only two books in the New Testament that tell us that Jesus was born to a virgin in the city of Bethlehem. I know that your viewers will find that strange, but of 27 books in the Christian Bible, only 2 of them make that assertion. What's very striking about Matthew and Luke is they're very late books. Even in the chronology of the New Testament, they're written about 80, 85, long after Paul's letters, long after the book of Hebrews, long after the book of Mark. And here we have this idea that he was born in Bethlehem, but each of them independently use a strategy, use a plot device to have the baby born in Bethlehem. They're contradictory plot devices, but they both concede that he was originally they both concede that he's from Nazareth, that ultimately he winds up in Nazareth, and they use contradictory methods to get him there. And they have contradictory methods to get him to be born in Bethlehem. Completely contradictory. That seems to point us in the direction that this was a real figure of history, and both of these writers, we don't know who wrote Luke, we don't know who wrote Matthew, but whoever wrote them worked really hard to get him to be born in Bethlehem. Why? There's good reason for it, because Bethlehem was the birthplace of King David. See 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 56. So these writers want him to be born in Bethlehem. And they work so hard at this that it seems like he probably was originally from an unknown place. When I say unknown, the city of Nazareth is mentioned nowhere in Tanakh, nowhere in the Talmud, nowhere in Josephus. It was a nothing town. If the archaeologists are correct, then the Nazareth, which is not the present day large city of Nazareth in Israel, where the largest Christian community in the Holy Land lives. I'm not talking about that. Forget that. I'm talking about the ancient Nazareth was literally a one-horse town in the Upper Galilee. If they're right, that means he came out of the backwaters of nowhere, and then these Matthew and Luke would independently try to get him to be born in Bethlehem. So that would point in the direction that Jesus was not a mythical figure, but he was a real person who really is from Nazareth and was born in Nazareth. And that's why Christians, not routinely, but always refer to Jesus as Jesus of Nazareth, never Jesus of Bethlehem. That's the name that stuck. So this is not the kind of proof you, the viewer, want, but that's really good stuff. Now, in terms of Chazal, like what did Chazal have to say about him? You're asking really challenging questions. So in the Talmud, so although people go, well, the Talmud was written in the year 500, but that means when the Talmud was finally edited, compiled, that doesn't mean it was written then. In fact, there is a very famed contributor to the Talmud that actually appears in the Christian Bible, in the book of Acts, Rabbi Gamliel. So the Talmud has contributors that date back to 150 BCE. That would be the period of the Tanoim all the way to the year, let's say about 200, till Rabbi Huda the Prince, known as Rabbi Huda Hanossi. It's a period of more than 300 years. So as it turns out, we have texts in the Talmud that describe a Jesus, a Yeshu of Nazareth, if we go back to early manuscripts. However, this is a huge however. Listen very carefully. The Jesus that we find in the Talmud seems to be placed in a period of either the 1st century BCE, a student of Rabbi Shua ben Parachia, who was a Tana, very early Tana. He lived about 100 BCE, meaning he lived a century before the Jesus of Christianity. Or we have another figure, another Jesus figure, who was in the 2nd century, essentially the time of Rabbi Akiva. Now, both of those figures do not come off well. There's nothing positive about this person. Moreover, it is quite possible, I want you, the viewer, to know this, that all of these are the Jesus of Christianity, and the dates were altered in the Talmud because Jews didn't want to get killed. That means originally, the Jesus that we find in the Sanhedrin, in Gittin, it's all in Avodah Zarah, is really all the Jesus of Christianity. And this is a view, I think, that I wouldn't use the word consensus, but I'd like to. In reality, all of these texts in the Talmud are about the Yeshu of Christianity, of Nazareth. But when the Talmud was first written, it was and edited in about the year 500, maybe 530, So then there were very few Christians in Babylon. But more importantly, the Christians had no power in Babylon. So the rabbis in Babylon who compiled the Talmud had no fear of Christians. But Christianity the church, Christendom, would move east rapidly. So by the time you get to the 9th century or so, it's quite possible that we edited the Talmud so that it doesn't appear to be the Jesus of Christianity, but when in fact it is. Now, if you want me to go on, it gets even more interesting because this gets very interesting.
Please go on, yeah.
All right. I don't talk about this much, but I'll do it here with you. So as it turns out, in our earliest traditions, this Jesus was born out of an illicit affair between a woman named Mary, and a Roman soldier named Pondera. It's a Roman name. And as it turns out, he had no Jewish father. Okay. Now, this would be very striking because we have this in really old sources that this Jesus is born out of an illicit relationship, Jewish mother, so he's a Jew, but non-Jewish father. It's really problematic. And in fact, she's married, so it's really bad. Now, is it just an accident, or is this just some sort of, it just happens to be that the Christian Bible will come up with the notion that Jesus didn't have a human Jewish father, meaning he was born of a virgin, and the Jews have really ancient sources, and I mean really ancient, it's not legendary, really ancient sources that he also didn't have a human Jewish father. But Christianity would come up with a way to address that problem in a way that's complementary. He was born to a virgin, the Son of God, and the Talmud would convey that, in fact, she was the furthest thing from a virgin, and in fact, Jesus was born to an illicit relationship. Is this just a coincidence? And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, doesn't sound like it. I mean, why would they come up with this? It gets even more interesting, because if you think I'm reaching here, if you think that I'm trying to make this provocative, I'm actually trying to tone this down. It gets more interesting. Here's what you've never even considered. The notion that Mary was married to a man named Joseph, but he wasn't the father of Jesus, right? In the Christian Bible, that doesn't come up in the early writings of the New Testament. Meaning, let's just think for a moment. If Mary was in fact impregnated by a Roman soldier, so there's no Joseph, he's the mythical figure who's introduced later to sort of shield the situation, what would you expect to find in early Christian literature? You would expect to discover that in the earliest writings of the New Testament, Joseph, the husband of Mary, is not mentioned. And that's exactly what you find. What you discover is that in the letters of Paul are huge. And Paul is by far the most prolific author in the New Testament. An enormous part of the Christian Bible is attributed to him. It's enormous. Paul never mentions Joseph, never does. So that's early stuff. The book of Hebrews, that's written before the Gospels, no mention of Joseph. It gets even more interesting. In the book of Mark, the earliest chronologically of the four Gospels, the book of Mark, Joseph is never mentioned. Mary's husband is never mentioned, let alone that she was a virgin. Never mentioned. Even more crazy interesting, in Mark chapter 6, it's not Joseph who was the carpenter, but Jesus was the carpenter. In fact, our only source that Jesus was a carpenter is Mark chapter 6, verse 3, a tekton in Greek, which means a kind of just a craftsman. We only find Joseph being snuck into the scene where this new actor is inserted into the Christian scene in Matthew and Luke, which are written about 10, 15 years after the book of Mark, meaning around the year 80, 85. How interesting. Moreover, here's where it gets crazy. In the book of John, only Joseph, the husband of Mary, is mentioned, but not Mary, the mother of Jesus, by name. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is mentioned in the book of John, just not by name, for reasons that are beyond the scope of your question. So therefore, all of this, that's all we can do, is collect this vast amount of literature and tease it out very carefully using rigorous methodology, and we can conclude that what Chazal, what our sages of blessed memory convey to us. Now, no doubt, all these texts in the Talmud and all these Talmudic Midrashic texts means really, really early stuff, no doubt had to be toned down a bit because we didn't want to get killed. And we censored a lot of our material, a lot of our prayers, because Christians had a way of dealing with problems, and that is killing people who created problems. There's your answer.
Very interesting. So is the reason why they try to insert it later is because they were trying to fit in the, the genealogy of Joseph, because they had to kind of prove that Jesus came from the line of David, right? So is that why they felt the need to do it? Like, why did they just decide to insert Joseph later on? What would be their reasoning?
Well, so here's what happens. Independently, the idea that Jesus was A, born to a virgin, and B, born in Bethlehem, all of that, these are ideas that developed orally, traditions that developed in the early Christian world. We're talking about the first century. So, right. For example, let's say the book of Mark is written about the year 70, about the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. In fact, the destruction is mentioned in Mark chapter 13. So let's say it's written about, so that's from the crucifixion, the year 30, to the year 70, that's 40 years. Now, 40 years may not seem like a lot of time. It's an enormous amount of time. And in that period, the average expected lifespan was 25, 30. How long did people live? I mean, if modern medicine did not exist, would you be alive today? Would I be alive today? I'm not sure. Okay. All right, there you go. So this is so therefore there's a lot of development. Now, the idea of a virgin birth, that the demigods were born to virgins, was very well known and widely believed in the Greco-Roman world and beyond. In the East, they just were. It didn't make a difference. It was Romulus, the founder of Rome, Octavius, Caesar Augustus, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, all of them born to virgins, because they were Pythagoras, the great thinker, philosopher, all born to virgins, mothers impregnated by Zeus. So this idea was very attractive to the whole world around that this was emerging in. And then you need a cover. You need like, she got married to somebody, or else something might have occurred. Something would then have to be explained. Because if she got pregnant and had no husband, then everyone would be jumping of like, where's the husband, and accusing her of these things. So the Joseph character would probably have to be developed a little bit later, and that's how I think these things developed. And then you're stuck with the issue of the Messiah has to be from the house of David. We have very specific prophecies in Tanakh that Mashiach has to come not only from the tribe of Judah, but from the house of David. So you need that. Whoever wrote the book of Matthew, we don't know who wrote it, it was written anonymously, was very well aware of that. And in his first chapter, he traces the genealogy of Joseph. That's just the first 16 verses of the book of Matthew. Now, the crazy thing that you should have all picked up is that's the genealogy of Joseph. What does Joseph have to do with Jesus if Joseph wasn't his father? It's all silly. And for those of you who don't know this, the only way tribe identity could be conveyed is through the father, not the mother. Numbers chapter 1. That's it. It has to be daddy. Only a father could convey tribal identification. Jewishness, mother, if you'll ask why, that's in the Torah as well. So each one is a separate thing. So what happened was when the church introduced the idea of a virgin birth, it actually sabotaged the notion that Jesus could be the Messiah, because then he lacks a human Jewish father with which to trace his genealogy back to King David. Joseph's putative genealogy in Matthew and in Luke are contradictory and irrelevant. And nowhere does it say that Mary was from the house of David. It wouldn't be relevant, but Christians try to deal with it. So you have a lot of this stuff going on at the same time. It doesn't hurt the church that their primary audience with whom they're successful with converting are pagans, those who knew little about the faith they were asked to embrace. And that's why I'd be successful among them.
Yeah, I think it's very significant that the claim that the Christians have that Jesus was the king of the Jews, you see that all over. You see that in all these movies they make about him. And king of the Jews would be something that we would all notice, right? It's nowhere to be found anywhere. We don't have, like we mentioned before,